Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and a very warm welcome to Being Conscious. In continuation in our first series of The Untethered Soul by Michael Singer, we are going to talk about the seventh chapter in this book. We are going to deconstruct the essence of the chapter. If you remember the last video, we talked about the secrets of the spiritual heart. Now, taking a step closer, taking a step deeper, we would talk about the transcending the need to close. If you haven't watched the last video, the sixth video in this series, I would highly recommend you to watch that before you dive into this video, because it's sort of a chain which we are going through, a chronological event of series of content. I mean, even if you watch this video in isolation, it will make sense. But essentially, if you maintain the order, things will fall in place. Coming to the topic of this video. Now, in the last video, we talked about how one of the most potent portal of consciousness, the heart chakra, at the source of energy, the seat of consciousness, has this tendency to open or close based on different kind of situations. If the situation is according to the script of your mind, you have the tendency to open. But if it's otherwise, you have the tendency to close. Now, when we talk about the need for close, we will explore this attribute, we'll explore the need to close. From eons of evolution, from the way human evolution has happened, from eons, the basic instinct of every human being is survival. Our human brain, the human brain, is working on the system of protecting and surviving. It's always designed to seek threat. Now that's the reason why it is so easy to be affected when someone is criticizing you versus so difficult to accept praises, a positive reinforcement comments. The point is very simple. Since human evolution has happened, since eons of evolution of mankind, the tendency of the human mind has always been to seek threat. It's always been to protect oneself from perceived threat. Focus a lot on the wordings I'm using here because they have a certain detail, a certain intricate nuance. Now, the nuance which I want to focus your attention on is, why do we have the tendency to close? The reason we have the tendency to close is to protect ourselves. Now, why do we feel the need to be protected? Because somewhere down the line, we feel threatened by a loss of self-concept. Now, imagine the same scenario in the physical dimension. If the same level of sensitivity existed in the physical space, the biological community or the community of medical professionals would diagnose us as sick, as physically in certain kind of ailment. But psychological sensitivity is considered normal. If you have a bruise on your car, or if somebody creates a insensitive remark, a so-called insensitive remark, that can have lasting repercussions. But why is that the case? Why are we so firmly attached to our self-concept, to the ego, to the script of the mind, which is always thinking of protecting oneself? The need to be defensive stems from the root of this consciousness. Now, it is very important to address this point because everything falls down to the root. The root thought process, the root belief system. Now, if you deconstruct this, the need to close. Now, what you might think that what is the need to transcend, the need to close? It is always a good idea to protect myself, then why should we transcend the need to close? If we transcend the need to close, the ultimate freedom is ours to choose. Now, let me explain to you, let me give you a practical example which makes a lot of sense to you. Now, let's say you're walking on the street and you see a luxurious car just move in front of your very eyes. Now, if it is okay for you to just view the car moving at a corner distance from you, and you just saw the car and it was okay, all that was fine. But the problem arises when you start thinking that maybe I also need that car. And you start comparing your salary of being an improper fit, and you think your salary is lower to buy that luxurious car. Now the problem with this mindset is you didn't just enjoy the event, but you tried to create a complete narrative out of that scene. Now all this point is boiling down to the ultimate concept of what is the need to close. The need to close, as we understood, is always to protect the self-concept. Why do we feel a need to protect self-concept? Because we feel that our ego is threatened. Now to understand this terms of consciousness and object of consciousness, let me give you an example which will hit the nail properly. Now let's say there's a hammer. You are holding a hammer and suddenly the hammer drops. The hammer drops as that it falls on your feet, and suddenly all your attention is focused on your toe. Now it is focused on your toe, so consciousness is always attracted towards disturbance. The object of consciousness in this case is the hammer, but your consciousness attention is completely focused on it. Now this is a very gross physical example, but this can be articulated in so many psychological dimensions which you and me face on a day-to-day basis. Somebody gives an insensitive remark, somebody is talking not as per your script of the mind, and suddenly you create this story. Suddenly consciousness has now directed to that particular incident, and it's playing back to back, back to back. Now what is the problem with this thought process? What is the problem with this entire mechanics? The problem lies that every time you face such a similar situation in the future, there will always be a tendency to close. There will always be this fear within you that probably something will go wrong. And this is the root cause of the people thinking syndrome, what the world thinks about me. If you go deeper into this psychology, nobody is actually thinking about us. Everybody is essentially thinking about themselves, because every human being is only concerned about their affairs. The only reason they might be thinking about you is because you're somewhere related to them. When you understand the psychology of the thought processes, you begin to laugh at your own stupidity. You begin to laugh at your own childish behavior. But there needs to be a sense of separation between the object of consciousness and consciousness, which majority of people lack. What do I mean by that? As I told you in the example of the hammer dropping and your complete attention is on the pain. The attention is so intense that it almost feels like there is no difference between you and the pain. But here lies the golden trick. Here lies the key point which Michael is talking about in this chapter. And today's modern day neuroscience calls this metacognition. You are different from the object of consciousness. The hammer in the case was the object of consciousness, but your complete focus and attention on that pain is you yourself, the seat of consciousness. Now consciousness and object of consciousness are so different like day and night. They are absolutely different, but the problem is in the heat of the moment we are unable to distinguish that, and that's the root of suffering, and that's the root of bondage. Because you are bonded every time you protect yourself, every time you try to protect yourself from a sense of perceived threat. Because that perceived threat is only lying in your imagination, and you are only trying to avoid that fear, you are trying to suppress that tendency, thinking that you will feel protected if you don't engage. Now the solution which Michael is offering in this, you don't have to suppress, you just have to take back your seat of consciousness. Instead of getting engaged in it, go back, take a step back and observe it. Observe it dispassionately and let it pass through you. Once you develop the skill, this art of observing things dispassionately, things will move through you. And nobody in this world can take your freedom but you. The inner freedom which you and me possess, it is all rooted, it's all there in the capacity to become seated in your seat of consciousness. The ability to distinguish between the object of consciousness and the consciousness itself is true freedom. Because no matter what happens in your world, nothing affects you anymore. You are in a state of liberation. You are in a state of constant mukti. Because whatever is happening in this world is always subject to law of change. Nothing in this world is permanent. Today something is great, tomorrow something is bad. Everything is always in a state of constant chaos. If you talk about quantum physics, if you talk about the law of entropy, it's always suggesting that it always moves from higher potential to lower potential. So nothing in this world is static. Everything is always under constant motion. Now once you realize, once you acknowledge this, and once you are unaffected by whatever happens, you can go inside, you can do anything you want without the fear, without the need to protect yourself. And that is true freedom. Because you're now not concerned with what the world thinks. You can freely be yourself. Because the reason why we are concerned on what the world thinks is because we feel that our self-concept will be threatened. But what we are failing to acknowledge and understand is that object of consciousness, which is the stimulus from the external world, has nothing to do with the seat of consciousness. Now there's another granular detail which Michael talks about in this chapter, where he is clearly saying that every human being has thoughts, negative and positive. Having thoughts of negative emotions like jealousy, anger, fear is not a problem. Every human being has it. But the problem comes when we become attached to that particular frequency. When you think that we are the thoughts, but essentially we are not the thoughts. We are the consciousness which is experiencing this ever-changing reality. Once you understand this, once you make it a day-to-day habit of practicing the metacognition which today's modern day neuroscience talks about, there will come a point where we will transcend the need to close. And that is true mukti, true freedom. And this is what all spiritual practices are aiming towards. To create that space where we are unaffected, absolutely unbothered with what's happening. And this is what Lord Krishna talked about in the Bhagavad Gita, where he talked about a yogi is a person who is not affected by in times of happiness, in times of distress. He's always constant. Now this tendency of constancy, this tendency of being the Sthita Prajna, a person who was able to create this tendency of always being seated in his consciousness, will naturally be liberated, naturally transcend the need to close. I hope my today's video gave a unique perspective on Michael's chapter on the transcending to need to close. If you really enjoy this, do share it with a couple of your own friends and well-wishers who you feel this video will serve well. Thank you so much, and I'll meet you in the next video in the series of the Untethered Soul. Thank you. Bye.